this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football. So tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Bounty and Swiffer cleaning products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in-store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
Wasabi is purpose-built to free your business from skyrocketing storage costs and fees. Wasabi is the go-to provider for professional and collegiate sports teams around the world. Check out Wasabi's AI-enabled intelligent media storage, Wasabi Air, to the industry's only cloud storage service with triple protection against cyber criminals. Wasabi, driving innovation in data storage for up to 80% less than market competition. Try for free at wasabi.com. Wasabi Hot Cloud Storage, proud partner of iHeart Podcast Network.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 1108 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, thanks for tuning in. This time last week, I had a conversation with Late Round Fantasy Football's own Brandon Gdula about catchable targets. He had done a study for one of our newsletters on the topic, and there were some really interesting takeaways for 2026 drafts. Well, this week we're running it back, but instead of catchable targets, I had a conversation with Brandon about an even more important fantasy football topic, the RB2 Rebirth. The NFL has slowly morphed into a slightly different game than what we saw 6, 7, or 8 years ago. We've got heavy personnel all over the place. We have a run-heavier league in general, and that's made an impact on fantasy football. When I talked about the death of the fantasy football wide receiver 2 back in January, one of the things I dug into was positional target share data. Quite simply, how targets were distributed across wide receiver, running back, and tight end. With more tight end usage came lower wide receiver target shares. But things have been changing at running back too. That's what Brandon really investigated in a newsletter that he had sent out last week. Which, just a reminder, guys, that newsletter is totally free. There's no reason to not be signed up. But that research last week was so good that I wanted to do another episode of the show with Brandon. Not only does it allow you guys to get to know him and his approach a little bit better, but man, it's just really good and thoughtful research that's going to make all of us better players. At the very least, it'll probably make you feel a little bit differently about this game. Brandon found some very interesting pass-catching trends at running back. We'll get into that in just a second. First, this is one of your final reminders to get the late round draft guide at its pre-order price. That guide's going to launch Friday this week, and with it pretty much completed, I can confidently tell you guys that it's the most comprehensive piece of fantasy football content that I've ever put together. There's almost 300 pages of content. There's strategy talk, ways to find breakouts, players to target, players to avoid, rankings and tiers, and more. You can check it out and learn more over on lateround.com. Now let's get to this discussion with Brandon Gdula. All right, Brandon, back-to-back weeks with the Late Round Podcast. You sent a newsletter out last week on this sort of changing receiving landscape at running back. What made you dig into the topic?
Well, I was writing up some market score sections for something called the Late Round Draft Guide, which releases July 10th this week. It's going to be updated weekly, new market score information. I'm excited, so make sure you head over to lateround.com to pre-order that. But yeah, so I'm digging through market score sections, kind of introing, each position, going through, and naturally, as you do content, you flow through position by position, quarterback, running back, receiver, tight end. So I'm rolling right out of quarterback, and I'm going into running back, and it just kind of it emerged in the market score analysis that quarterback has this sort of underlying value through rushing, and what you kind of dig into with quarterback, also it's a very similar sort of process at running back. I mean, Rich Rebar, of course, coined the Konami code, as in rushing quarterbacks being, cheat codes for fantasy football. But now we get into a scenario in the NFL where we have rushing quarterbacks who can actually rival some of the top pocket passers with their arms as well. So that's what separates these guys, like a Josh Allen, a Peak Lamar. It makes them so impactful. And then as you're digging through market score, as you'll learn, and if you've listened to JJ for a while, you realize it's the sort of secondary lever of production at running back, but pass catching matters a lot. And so it was just such a clear parallel of how two of the most important factors in fantasy football are secondary components of two of the four fantasy positions. So, quarterback rushing and running back receiving. So I'm looking at this and I'm like, okay, there's got to be, a simple sort of way to kind of draw this together. And, this year we've got really a big two, but you probably throw Christian McCaffrey in there as a pure big three, because we have running backs who have elite rushing volume, have elite receiving volume, and good goal line rolls, if not great goal line rolls. So I was like, okay, it's very similar at the top. And then it kind of hit me though, because we have a Malik Willis this year at quarterback. Could be a cheat code, could just, rush his way. But we also have got, Jackson Dart, Bo Nix, Kyler Murray types, these guys who aren't just all legs. And then it kind of was like, well, who are the names at running back who fit that sort of Malik Willis mold?
Yeah.
The sort of PPR scammer kind of players that we've all grown to love over the years. And it just kind of hit me that there weren't a lot of them coming to mind. And so I started digging in, and I think I found some interesting data.
Yeah, let's talk about that data. So at a macro level, what are you seeing happening league-wide with receiving volume at running back?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting just to drop that we're all looking at tight ends and how they're seeing more targets. And you broke down the death of the fantasy football wide receiver 2 earlier this offseason. So, we're talking about tight ends. You looked specifically, from how is this impacting receivers? But I feel like the running back piece of the puzzle has not been discussed quite to the same level. And I understand it. It's a smaller piece of the pie overall. But what we are talking about at running back is how expensive they are in drafts. At least that's how a lot of people feel. And, we've had good luck with running back injuries lately. I think there's just more to discuss though. So as we dig into running back trends, as far as pass catching goes, we see that target share is down a bit lately. So last year, 17.7% of targets went to running backs. That was the second lowest mark over the last decade, beating out just 2024's 17.1%. The 8 years prior averaged over 19%. It was 19.3%. So target share is down as far as running backs go, but overall pass volume's down as well. And so clearly there has to be some impact, right? But what is the total impact? And one thing I noticed was targets per rush are just down its position. It's been down under 0.25 for each of the last 2 seasons. The 8 years prior, we're sitting closer to 0.3, multiple seasons in that span well above a 0.3. So it might sound like a small gap, but that stuff adds up. And so I think that it's clear to say at a real macro level, things are changing at running back in terms of how pass catchers are being distributed.
Yeah, and targets per rush, just so you guys can really take that in, it's simply the amount of targets that a running back's seeing versus how many rushes that he's seeing. So it's proportion, right? So the lower the number means the more rush attempts, if you will, versus how many targets that player's seeing. How has this impacted then the fantasy relevant running backs?
Yeah, so, we have to isolate things to look at some sort of fantasy relevance to get the most out of this. And fantasy relevant running backs can mean a lot of different things, but I did a pretty high level look at the position. I looked for running backs who played at least 8 games in a season and averaged at least 10 PPR points per game. You get around 33 of those players per season over the last decade. So I think that kind of sums up who matters, and who doesn't, sort of. Just kind of a pretty simple, clean cutoff there. And you'll see a similar dip with targets per rush as you do position wide. But we've actually seen a sub 0.24 mark each of the last 2 years if you look at just the super relevant fantasy running backs. But of course, that coincides with a league-wide drop in pass rate. So we can say that the most important backs for fantasy football have been seeing a decline in their ratios as well. So that kind of inherently tells us like this is, relevant. It's not just sort of the throwaway backs getting, fewer targets and more carries, perhaps. It's also impacting the guys who, we care about weekly, the top sort of like 36 players. So, and one of the things here is we're seeing a similar number of backs getting to 10 PPR points per game, but they're doing it a little bit less because of their receiving. Of course, there's more to the puzzle than just that, which I think, again, it was like I was like peeling back layer after layer as I got here. So, similar number of backs getting to that fantasy relevant cutoff, but obviously the pass catching's down. So I think there's a little more to it.
Yeah. I mean, and one of the things that you sort of talked about in the newsletter that I think is really interesting and something that I think, I've mentioned maybe in like passing, but there wasn't that much hard data to establish it and to talk through it. But there's, the passing game specialists that we used to be able to rely on more in like zero RB builds. I mean, like Chris Thompson back in the day was like a legit viable PPR RB2 option, just because he was, the PPR scammer, as you noted earlier. So what does the data say about those pass game specialists?
Yeah, it's a real bummer because I love these guys. Like when my longest running home league switched to full PPR and, you're playing 3 receivers plus a flex. It's like, it was the height of zero RB. I was like, cool, I'll kind of get like that anchor running back with some pass catching, but I can get Tariq Cohen or Theo Riddick or Chris Thompson or James White and get like 11 PPR points per game just because he's just kind of getting these checkdowns. And it's like, where did these guys go? Right? Like, is it just sort of a temporary shift? Was I over like romanticizing how many of these guys there were? But so I dug in, tried to look for that hard data, as you mentioned. And so what I did was looked for running backs over the last 10 years with 8.5 or fewer carries per game. So around 150 carries per 17 games, but they still managed at least 10 PPR points per game. So like if I looked at some sort of ratio of pass catching, we would have included like Christian McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara types, which isn't what we wanted. So I did segment it by rushing volume here. And so that leaves 32 seasons the past decade. The guys who made multiple appearances, just a real who's who of the types of names we're talking about, but Austin Eckler, James White, JD McKissick, Naeem Hines, Rex Burkhead, and Tariq Cohen. So exactly the types of players that we would be thinking of. But out of these 32 seasons, just 7 have come over the last 5 years, and we didn't even have one in 2023. So we went from 5.0 instances per season of running back getting at least 10 PPR points per game on 8.5 or fewer carries per game from 2016 to 2020 to 1.4 over the last 5 years. So it's not fully like that these players don't exist anymore. Kenneth Gainwell got there in 2025. Austin Eckler and Zach Charbonnet did in 2024. But it's a rare archetype now. And I think like if you just left it there, it's like, okay, that's interesting, but it's not super helpful. Just maybe like you can't find the free PPR points at the end of the draft or, in like the mid rounds. But again, it was just like layer after layer. I think there's more to the story.
Yeah. Okay. So to sum up where we're at right now, we're not necessarily seeing fewer fantasy relevant running backs, right? The running backs are still kind of doing their thing, scoring a similar number of points, let's say at the threshold that we were looking at, but we are seeing fewer pass game specialists, right? And so, my biggest question is, where is that production going? And even still, like we are seeing this decrease in target share, but it's not like a 3% decrease in target share running back, right? Like there's still like running backs are still being like the bigger issue with like the heavy personnel seems to be more wide receiver driven in terms of like the decline in target share. So, but running back has seen a little bit of a decline. But I guess my question is, we're seeing these fantasy relevant running backs. We're not seeing it from these pass catching specialists. So where is all that running back production going?
Yeah. So, I made a hypothesis. I was like, well, it's probably just going to like these featured backs who are staying healthy. And that is sort of the end of the story. I was wrong. That's not really the case. Like, yeah, when Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan and Christian McCaffrey are healthy, they're going to have big target shares and eat up a lot of the overall targets. And it's partly true.
Yeah. Right.
These guys exist, and when they do, they're again just accounting for a lot of the receiving. But there's been like a slight dip in their rushing workloads. If you look at like the high volume rushers, so players averaging at least 15 carries per game, to get real like semantics based here, like the featured backs are seeing a slightly diminished role by about 0.4 carries and 0.4 targets per game. But that also kind of just coincides. We're seeing a dip in overall play volume. Clock's always moving because teams are just running the ball, more efficient passing. So I don't really want to get stuck on that point. And again, that 0.4 carries and 0.4 targets compares 2016 to 2020, that 5-year sample, and then 2021 to 2025. So I'm not really like ringing alarm bells there. But what we have seen is that a medium volume running back is just getting more carries and more targets. So, I had the 8.5 carry per game cutoff for pass catching running backs. And then the high volume, sort of the featured backs, getting 15 plus carries, per game. That's about 250 carries over a full season. So if you think about it, like 150 carry backs and lower, 250 carries and higher, there's a pretty like big relevant, now mid-range between 150 and 250 carries. And that's really the types of players we've seen benefiting. So from that 2016 to 2020 sample and from 2021 to 2025, if you just split these up into 5-year buckets, basically 33 relevant backs, per season in each sample, technically slightly more recently, which is interesting. But if you imagine like a pie of those 33 players each season, from 2016 to 2020, 13 of those on average were high volume rushers. In the recent sample, it's still 13. So we're not seeing more of these high volume rushers getting there. The low volume rushers, as we already mentioned, went from 5 per season to 1.4 per season. So it basically just leaves the medium volume guys who went up from about 15 to about 19 per season. So it's not like groundbreaking. It's not like, hey, the only players who are relevant are like these weird, you have to have exactly 200 carries per season. That's not what it is. But what I think is interesting is that we're not just seeing it funneled to the featured players, which you could probably dismiss as like, yeah, they're healthier, so they're just seeing bigger workloads. It seems like there's a pretty concentrated effort or just a shift in philosophy where maybe you can't really get on the field if all you can do is catch the ball. As personnels are getting heavier, you probably need to be able to handle 10, 12 carries a game and get like, 2, 3, 4 targets per game. Mm-hmm. So as you continue to think about this, you kind of will see the types of players who are more relevant and why we might not have some of the frankly smaller, shiftier, PPR running backs still being relevant today.
For adults with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis symptoms, every choice matters. Tremfya offers self-injection or intravenous infusion from the start. Tremfya is administered as injections under the skin or infusions through a vein every 4 weeks, followed by injections under the skin every 4 or 8 weeks. If your doctor decides that you can self-inject Tremfya, proper training is required. Tremfya is a prescription medicine used to treat adults with moderately to severely active Crohn's disease and adults with moderately to severely active ulcerative colitis. Serious allergic reactions, increased risk of infections or lower ability to fight them, and liver problems may occur. Before treatment, get checked for infections and tuberculosis. Tell your doctor if you have an infection, flu-like symptoms, or need a vaccine. Explore what's possible. Ask your doctor about Tremfya today. Call 1-800-526-7736 to learn more or visit tremfyaradio.com.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football, so tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Bounty and Swiffer cleaning products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
Do you think that this means, because look, we just did the draft guide, and spoiler alert, a lot of the trends that we look for in our ADP analysis leans towards, hey, the market is not factoring in pass catching nearly enough with these running backs. Therefore, go after these running backs that had good previous season target shares, good previous season yards per route run rates. Do you think that no longer matters because this RB2 group is seeing such a boost in overall volume and they're becoming more relevant? Or do you think it matters more because receiving is just not as easy to come by anymore with some of these later round guys?
Yeah, it's the complete wrong takeaway to walk away from something like this and say that receiving matters less. It matters just as much, if not more, but just in a different way than we've kind of grown used to. So I'm gonna shout out our boy Jim Sonis here.
Yeah.
But he's my longtime podcast co-host, and he used a metric. I mean, it's a pretty simple metric, but he just called it adjusted opportunities. And what he did with adjusted opportunities was take a player's carries at running back and their targets and multiply their targets by X so that a player's workload kind of actually, accounted for, average fantasy points.
Yeah.
So if you were on a half PPR site, it's about double. You would double a player's targets compared to his carry. But in PPR leagues, that ratio is basically 2.5. So since 2016, the average running back carry has been worth about 0.6 fantasy points. But the average target across the position is like up over 1.5. I mean, you just think about like catch rate's like 75%, right?
Yeah.
Like you get a target, you got like 75% chance to get a PPR point, which is better than a carry. Now, of course, you're not
plus the yards and plus the touchdowns, et cetera.
Yes, exactly. Right. So it's like at a baseline, it's like, targets are really valuable for, especially at running back in terms of just getting a point. But it's not about find the guys who get more targets than carries. Like it's never really the case. You want carries, but you also want the targets. So, and we know that like that's just how a traditional workload goes. But when you contextualize the workloads, you see how valuable targets still are at running back, and that's really starting to impact the way. Because again, this simple thought process of how valuable a target is at running back is why players like Austin Eckler and Chris Thompson could just get their way to points without having the carries, because one carry is equal to 4 targets or whatever. Like, so this is really starting to take shape for how I'm looking at 2026.
Yeah. How is it impacting your draft strategy in general? I mean, I would imagine you're sitting here and you might not have as easy of a time getting late round running backs. Like, is that sort of the way that you're viewing this?
So I think the real shift here for me is there are still a few guys who I think fit. I'll start here. I think there are a few guys who fit the historical mold of a PPR specialist. Players who might not crack 150 carries, but still have good receiving roles. Rashad White is the first one who comes to mind.
Yeah.
He could be like the guy at the, who just, again, PPR scams his way to like a relevant season without getting a ton of carries. Alvin Kamara, as we don't really know, but he could be someone who he could be top 10 in targets. We don't know, because Travis Etienne, I think he's a viable pass catcher, but I think his role as a pass catcher is always overstated, which is interesting. Kenneth Gainwell again, RJ Harvey. There's like a path for Tyjae Spears. I feel like Tyjae Spears in the past would have been such an obvious, he's going to get 3-4 catches a game, that kind of thing. But we're past the point where Dylan Sampson types are going to have their opportunity to get 7 targets a game. Just kind of not how it works.
Yeah.
So it's not that nobody with this archetype can be fantasy relevant. I think it's just a shorter list than we're used to historically. And what this really does is puts the spotlight on those backs who are projected more for like 200 carries, who have receiving juice. I think the easiest player to think about is Jaylen Warren.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Jaylen Warren probably historically would have been in the PPR merchant like bucket, but because he's able to handle carries, he is a relevant player. He's been at 149, 120, and then 211 carries over his last 3 seasons. I think if he was not able to handle 200 carries, he would just sort of get phased out.
Yeah.
And whenever you extrapolate that kind of thought process, you see more names. An Aaron Jones type, it doesn't seem like he's just set for massive rushing volume, but we know he can handle 10, 12, 14 carries if he needs to. Ramondre Stevenson, I'll throw a Travion Henderson in there, Chuba Hubbard. I think that like another way to sum this up other than the Jaylen Warren archetype is that historically I would have been out on having Travion and Ramondre together, but this is like a new balanced workload that is leading to relevant seasons when it comes to pass catching running backs because they both can handle carries and targets. And so one thing I also want to point out here is any zero RB truthers who are like, well, we've been running hot with running back injuries. These are also the types of players who should be able to handle featured workloads if somebody else gets hurt. I think I think that is a huge piece of this puzzle that we're probably not, if you look team by team, go down the depth chart, you're probably not seeing the amount of, if the starter is hurt, they're going to give this player, the 2-down work and somebody else the pass catching work. I just don't think there's a lot of those scenarios. I think it's if you don't have both, you're probably not going to see the field as much because personnel is getting heavier overall. So this makes players like Cam Scatterbo really interesting. He's not going to be the highest volume pass catcher, but he has the juice and he can handle workloads. Chase Brown, I know you've been high on Chase Brown.
Yep.
He's really emerging as like the type of player who he doesn't have the full Christian McCaffrey workload, but he's so far and away better of a profile than someone who just has like the 2-down work. And so if you, on the flip side, like a Jadarian Price, J.K. Dobbins, David Montgomery, these guys probably don't have that in their range of outcomes. And so it's not that like you can just get Woody Marks instead of David Montgomery and replace his workload. It's more that there are players who have, like, they have to have this rushing, I think, nowadays to be on the field in order to have the pass catching that they need. So I think the biggest takeaway is those middle round guys with sort of ambiguous situations or not featured roles, they're actually getting more relevant because it's a valuable archetype to be able to handle like a mini featured back role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I also think that, number one, this is part of the reason that we've seen, aside from, I do think that running back injury rates have run a little bit hot, but I don't think that that's the sole, like you said, the reason that we can look at how predictive and how strong running back has been the last couple of years and just kind of leave it at that. I definitely kind of overrated that a little bit last year. But then, when thinking about it more and seeing trends and thinking about it through this lens, I don't think that that's the only reason why we should be going, or that we've seen what we've seen with running back. But then on top of that, like I think that running back has just become, as a result of all of this, right? Like there's a drop off that happens, but instead of it happening at the dead zone, it's happening later, right? It's happening not quite at the dead zone. We're not getting the players that we were able to necessarily later back in the day. And now all of a sudden that changes your draft strategy because, if there are only a handful of guys that we can really truly feel great about late, right? Then that means that you have to be the team that gets that player. And that's really hard to bank on when you're in round 1, round 2, and round 3, and you're deciding if you want to go a running back or not, which is why at the very least, I think you need a running back in the first couple of rounds. Like it's a lot more difficult to go zero RB in this kind of environment. And then the last thing I want to throw out there, the thing that I love about this most and love the way that the NFL has sort of moved and shifted and what it means for running back is that the evaluation of the running back himself is becoming more important in a way, because you really need to find the running back, like you said, that's almost like a mini bell cow that's able to handle a decent amount of work, but also handle a decent amount through the air, right? As opposed to, oh, he's just a passing game specialist, like he can find a role somewhere, or, he's just an early down bruiser, we can just fade him no matter what. There's so many more tweeners that we have to be a little bit more creative with how we're evaluating these running backs. And to me, that allows us who are degenerates with this stuff and just really, really, detail oriented with it, to spot interesting players that maybe we otherwise wouldn't have drafted, And so I think it's all incredibly interesting. And I hope people who listen to this, thought the same and are walking away, looking at the running back position a little bit differently. But Brandon, thank you again for hopping on. Let everyone know where they can find you and the good stuff that you're doing at this company called Late Round Fantasy Football.
Yeah, on Twitter at Gdula13, on Blue Sky at Gdula. And yeah, everything I do is, you can find it on lateround.com. Sign up for the newsletter. The reason I'm here is because I did a newsletter on this deep dive. It's nice to have a visual to all this stuff. Yeah. But yeah, everything I'm doing, lateround.com.
Yeah, I don't even need to repeat say much because Brandon already said it. Check out lateround.com. Make sure you pre-ordered the draft guide that is launching on July 10th. So it'll be out on Friday. And if you pre-ordered, probably be out, honestly, on Thursday evening, as I usually do, night before. So check it out, lateround.com. Otherwise, everyone, thanks for tuning in.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.